Bum 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 bum. It was Wednesday, June 5th, 1946. It was warm in Los Angeles. The air had cooled during the overnight hours, and by midnight, a light fog had settled over the low lying areas of the city. California Highway Patrolman Lauren Roosevelt had finished his shift a little after 1 a.m. and was on his way home. As he drove down Los Feliz Boulevard, Roosevelt spotted a car traveling at high speed. Despite being off duty, he pursued the vehicle, and as they reached the intersection at Brunswick Avenue, the car slowed, and Roosevelt pulled alongside. The patrolman was met with a burst of automatic gunfire which struck him 5 times. As the other car sped away, Roosevelt managed to pull his service revolver and return fire. The sounds of gunshots awakened the residents of nearby houses, many of whom called police, and soon the area was flooded with patrol cars. But the suspect had escaped. While canvassing the neighborhood, officers discovered a car parked alongside the street with a bullet hole in it. A search revealed a toolkit, an electric drill, a blasting cap, explosive primer cord, and nitroglycerin. These are things needed to crack a safe. This is Crime Noir, Episode 4, He Walked by Night, the Hollywood crime spree that spawned a TV franchise. If you find this content interesting, make sure to hit the like and subscribe buttons and leave us a comment. So, with that out of the way, let's move on. Officer Roosevelt was rushed to the hospital in critical condition. Despite his wounds, he was able to give a good description of his assailant and the details of the encounter. It was good information, but it did not immediately lead to an arrest. One of the officers assigned to the investigation was Detective Sergeant Marty Wynn. Detective Wynn was a long-time LAPD police officer who had gathered a long list of confidential informants. He relentlessly worked those informants, but none immediately got him any closer to a suspect. The LAPD launched a Dragnet and, in a move reminiscent of Captain Renault in Casablanca, rounded up the usual suspects. There had been a series of seemingly disconnected burglaries, and several suspects were detained, but none could have been the man who shot Officer Roosevelt. Police knew that Roosevelt's killer was behind some of the crimes that were occurring. They had witnessed descriptions that were close to that provided by the slain officer, but the man always seemed to be a step ahead of them. Detective Wynn stayed at it, and on December 19, 1946, 9 months after Officer Roosevelt's shooting, Wynn got a credible tip. The tip led him to a small apartment home at 1831.5 North Argyle Avenue in Los Angeles. Wynn staked out the apartment and watched the occupant come and go. He saw that the man matched the description given by Officer Roosevelt on his deathbed. At 2 a.m. the following morning, Wynn, accompanied by 2 other detectives, entered the apartment using a key provided by the landlord. They found the occupant asleep in his bed with a .45 pistol on the nightstand next to him. When the detectives burst into the room, he reached for a Thompson submachine gun that was lying beside him on the bed. A struggle ensued for the gun. The suspect was shot twice and pistol whipped before he was subdued. The man was identified as Erwin Walker, a war veteran and former civilian employee of the Glendale Police Department. He had worked as a dispatcher and radio technician, and a radio modified to receive police communications was found in his apartment. Erwin Matthias Walker was born on October 6, 1917. His father was a flood control engineer and his mother was a homemaker. The family lived in Glendale. Walker attended the Hoover School and spent 1 year at the California Institute of Technology. That is the sum total of what we know about Walker's early life. After dropping out of Caltech, Walker went to work for the Glendale Police Department until he was drafted in 1943. Because of his expertise in electronics, he was assigned to the Signal Corps and sent to Australia, where he received training in a ground radar system. He attended Officer Candidate School, was commissioned as a second lieutenant, and was assigned to a radar detachment that deployed to the Philippines. The unit arrived on Lady Island, set up its radar, and began operations. While near the front, they were in an area considered clear of Japanese troops. That was a mistaken assumption. The Japanese forces in the Philippines, and on Leyte in particular, were fragmenting, and many soldiers continued to hold out in small groups even after the islands were declared secure, and for many years after the war ended. The last holdout did not surrender until 1974. Once Walker's unit had its radar set up, they did not take normal security measures. Even though they had standard-issue weapons, these were not combat troops. These were Signal Corps technicians, not infantrymen. They were in an isolated area with no other units in close proximity. Walker had been sent to the ship that delivered the unit to the Philippines to pick up some supplies, and when he returned, he found that his unit had endured 3 days of continuous attacks by Japanese troops. Most of the men had been killed or wounded, and some were horribly mutilated. Walker was severely traumatized by these events and petitioned his commanding officer to be transferred. In December 1944, he returned to the United States and was promoted to first lieutenant. He was conveniently stationed near his home in Los Angeles, and in early 1945 he burglarized an auto repair shop, stealing some tools. That August, while still on active duty, he broke into an ordnance warehouse and stole a number of Thompson submachine guns, revolvers, and .45 pistols, along with ammunition and extra magazines. As an aside, it seems the experiences of the gangster era in the 1930s and 4 years of war did nothing to teach the Army to secure its weapons better. Bonnie and Clyde, along with several other criminal gangs, got many of their firearms by robbing Army and National Guard armories in the 1930s. Walker had no problem doing the same thing in the 1940s. Walker was discharged from the Army in November 1945 and promptly began his crime spree. He was unique among burglars in that he planned his crimes methodically from beginning to end. So many criminals concoct elaborate plans for carrying out their crimes, but fail to plan out how to escape or how to dispose of the loot. He was also a loner, involving no one else in carrying out his burglaries and using aliases when disposing of the proceeds. The main targets of Walker's endeavors were film and radio company warehouses. He stole electronic equipment, which he stashed in a rented garage that he had equipped as a workshop. Along the way, he acquired equipment that allowed him to fabricate phony driver's licenses and license plates. He stole cars and used his fake plates to reduce the chances of them being noticed by police. Walker used one of his aliases, Paul C. Norris, while attempting to sell some motion picture equipment to a sound engineer named Willard Starr. Starr sold filmmaking equipment out of his house at 1347 Fifth Avenue in Los Angeles and immediately realized that the equipment was stolen and called the police. Responding to the call, LAPD detectives Colin Forbes and Stuart Johnson staked out Starr's home, waiting for Walker to appear. They didn't have to wait long. On April 25, 1946, almost 2 months before CHP officer Lauren Roosevelt was shot, Walker was spotted approaching Starr's house. Forbes and Stewart confronted Walker, but without warning, he pulled a pistol and fired 3 shots, hitting both officers. Detective Johnson returned fire and hit Walker in the leg and abdomen. Walker's wounds were superficial, and he escaped by dodging into one of the subterranean storm drains beneath the city. He made his way back to his home and was able to patch himself up. Detectives Forbes and Stewart were taken to a nearby hospital where they were treated for their injuries and recovered, although Forbes carried a .45 slug lodged near his spine for the remainder of his life. Walker continued on his crime spree, and 7 weeks later he encountered Officer Lauren Roosevelt. Detective Marty Wynn continued working as informants, and after 9 months he got the tip that led to Walker's arrest. A search of Walker's apartment found a large cache of weapons and ammunition. There were also several fake and stolen license plates, along with multiple counterfeit driver's licenses. A check of the neighborhood turned up 3 stolen cars, one of which had a Tommy gun mounted to fire through the driver's door. At the hospital, Walker admitted to shooting Officer Roosevelt and Detectives Forbes and Johnson. When asked why he shot Roosevelt, Walker simply answered, "Had to." In the lead up to his trial, interviews with his relatives revealed extensive occurrences of mental illness on both sides of Walker's family. He had multiple recent and distant ancestors who had bouts of hallucinations, depression, and commitments to mental hospitals. In one of his interrogations, Walker stated that the reason for his crimes was to collect money and equipment to build a ray gun that turned metal into powder, hoping that this would make war too expensive to be prosecuted. He attempted an insanity defense, which ultimately failed, and on June 11, 1947, Walker was found guilty and sentenced to the gas chamber, and 2 weeks later he was taken to San Quentin to await execution of his sentence. But the story doesn't end there. Walker's father, Weston, took his son's conviction hard, and while spending his life savings in attempts to get the sentence overturned, he became more and more despondent. Erwin had been in San Quentin for about 6 months when his father paid him a visit on December 11, 1947. We do not know what they discussed, but the elder Walker had reached the breaking point. A few hours after returning home, he was found unconscious in his car. A hose connected to the tailpipe was fed through the car's window and into the interior. Doctors were unable to revive him, and he passed away. His appeals exhausted, Walker's sentence was scheduled to be carried out on April 15, 1949. The night before that final day, Walker attempted to take matters into his own hands with a radio headphone cord attached to his cell bars. He was successfully revived, and the following morning, a group of 7 psychiatrists convened to assess his mental state. The examiners determined that Walker was agitated at the prospect of his impending execution. I don't know, that seems reasonable to me. They found him to be depressed, which also seems reasonable given the circumstances, but the examiners noticed that he frequently became nearly catatonic and seemed to be responding to hallucinations. Walker's sentence was postponed. The board's finding precipitated a competency hearing. Walker, who had been a model prisoner and had acted completely normal until the day before his sentence was to be carried out, had to be carried into the courtroom as a male nurse with the help of 2 guards supported him in his chair to keep him from slumping to the floor. Walker was found to be legally insane by a jury and committed to the Mendocino State Hospital. Detective Marty Wynn was asked his thoughts on Walker's reprieve. He stated his belief that Walker would escape if ever given the chance. After a few months at Mendocino, Walker was moved to the Atascadero State Hospital, a maximum security mental facility. Walker was again a model prisoner, and by the fall of 1959 had progressed well enough to be housed in a dorm outside the hospital's maximum security area. On Saturday, October 31st, 1959, Walker made a dummy out of spare bed linens, grabbed a pack of food and water he had hidden, and took off into the hills surrounding the institution. Hospital staff did not notice that he was gone until Sunday morning. I guess Detective Sergeant Wynn knew what he was talking about. Walker's freedom was short-lived. He had gotten about 9 miles from the hospital when he was found cowering in some underbrush by a quail hunter just south of Santa Margarita, California. The hunter marched him down the hill to Highway 101, where a railroad gang was doing maintenance on the tracks. The men contacted police and held Walker until deputies arrived. The reason for Walker's escape attempt after more than 10 years as a model inmate was not that hard to understand. He figured that if he was sane enough to be moved out of the hospital and into the trustee dorm, then he was sane enough to be returned to San Quentin for his sentence to be carried out. Returned to Atascadero, Walker again became a perfect inmate, and by 1961, a new psychiatric panel examined him and declared him sane. He was fortunate that by then a new governor was in Sacramento who did not believe in capital punishment. Walker was transferred to the California State Prison at Vacaville, and his sentence was commuted to life without parole by Governor Pat Brown. In 1970, Walker filed a habeas corpus petition to the California Supreme Court, which was denied. In August of that year, he was granted a new trial, but the decision was overturned upon appeal. In 1974, he followed up by refiling the petition with the Solano County Superior Court and attempted to have his original trial verdict set aside by claiming his confession was coerced. The case wound its way through the appellate courts and returned to the state Supreme Court, which rendered a verdict in September of that year. Walker's conviction stood. However, the California Supreme Court ordered the lower court to amend his life sentence to include the possibility of parole. Walker applied for parole and it was granted. He was released from Vacaville and after a short time in a halfway house was released from any further restrictions. Erwin Walker was a free man. He immediately changed his name, obtained employment, and disappeared into anonymity. Erwin Walker passed away in 2008 at the age of 91. Usually, this would be the end of the story. However, it was an interesting crime because of Walker's methods and the length of time that his crime spree lasted. Now, I have no intent to glorify or excuse Walker's actions. His crimes were reprehensible. Officer Lauren Roosevelt was, by all accounts, a good man who was taken from this world too soon. Detectives Colin Forbes and Stuart Johnson carried the scars and physical pain of wounds inflicted by Walker for the rest of their lives. At the same time, Walker was certainly traumatized by his wartime experiences and perhaps suffered some level of mental illness, which in no way excuses what he did and the pain he inflicted. However, these crimes took place in Hollywood, and Walker's methods of committing them, along with the length of time it took to track him down, were the core of a good story. It just needed a production company to pick it up. In 1944, UK studio head Arthur Rank established an American subsidiary to handle his films in the US. He later joined forces with Pathé Industries and established a reciprocal distribution agreement for US films in the United Kingdom. In 1946, the joint company then formed a subsidiary called Eagle Lion Films. Eagle Lion released Rank Organization films and some re-releases of Selznick International films, but it also produced original productions focusing on film noir. It had some success, most notably as the American distributor of The Red Shoes, which was nominated for Best Picture at the 21st Academy Awards. Its bread and butter, though, was low-budget film noirs, one of which was the story of Erwin Walker's crime spree called He Walked by Night. He Walked by Night went into production just over a year after Erwin Walker was convicted. Alfred Werker is officially credited as the director, but many of the scenes in the film were directed by Anthony Mann. Werker was a well-established and competent director going back to the silent era, but many critics find his work unremarkable. Anthony Mann was a young upstart who became a highly respected director and went on to direct films such as Winchester 73, The Glenn Miller Story, El Cid, and The Fall of the Roman Empire. He was the first director on Spartacus, but disagreements with the film's star, Kirk Douglas, resulted in his being replaced by Stanley Kubrick. He Walked by Night is a fictionalized telling of Erwin Walker's crime spree, starring Richard Basehart and Walker's character renamed Roy Morgan. Although the story is told in a documentary style, it takes great liberties with the facts of the case. For instance, in the film, Morgan makes extensive use of Los Angeles' flood control drains to move about and store his loot and weapons. As far as is known, Walker only did that once, following the shooting of Detectives Forbes and Johnson. The movie equipment dealer, Willard Starr, became the owner of an electronics firm named Paul Reeves, played by Whit Bissell. Also, the circumstances of Morgan's capture in the movie are completely different from what actually happened. While the movie was in pre-production, the producers realized they needed a technical advisor. Having reviewed the script and being assured that the LAPD would be shown in a favorable light, Chief William Parker provided just the man for the job, Detective Marty Wynn, one of the men who captured Walker. Casting started, and the casting director remembered a somewhat gangly young voice actor who provided the voice of Pat Novak on the radio drama Pat Novak for Hire. That actor's name was Jack Webb. Webb was cast as crime lab technician Lee Whitey. Webb's part in the film was relatively small, and Marty Wynn was just there to answer questions, so both had a lot of downtime on the set. They spent it discussing how police were portrayed in the movies and on radio. It seems they were not portrayed all that well. Even on Jack's show, Pat Novak for Hire, when a cop appeared, he was lazy, corrupt, or brutish, and got in the way of solving the crime. Wynn questioned why radio shows and movies never portrayed police work as it really was, and how he thought a show that did that would do well. Initially, Jack was skeptical because fiction shows had such high ratings, but the idea stuck with him. Now, one of the interesting things about He Walks by Night is who is in it. Richard Basehart, in the role of the suspect, Roy Morgan, is phenomenal. By the time he appeared in He Walked by Night, Basehart had been on the stage for 10 years and had 2 other film credits behind him. He went on to a successful film career while also making guest appearances on episodic TV shows before landing the role he's best known for, Admiral Nelson in Voyage to the Bottom of the Sea. A few of the extras are interesting as well. In their initial roundup of suspects, the police bring in Frank Cady, who most people know as Sam Drucker, proprietor of the general store on Green Acres and Petticoat Junction. This is one of only 2 film roles in which I have seen Cady, the other being When Worlds Collide, where he also played a bad guy. Kenneth Tobey is questioning him. Some will recognize Tobey as the gate guard that Gregory Peck chews out when he arrives at the 918th Bomb Group in 12 O'Clock High. He went on to a decent career in B movies, starring in one of my favorites, It Came from Beneath the Sea, in which a giant octopus has its feeding grounds disturbed by nuclear tests and decides to eat San Francisco for revenge. Luckily, some plucky scientists in the U.S. Navy are around to save the day. Tobey was an actor who was up for anything, and between 1949 and 1996, he appeared in just about everything. He showed up in Daniel Boone, Doctari, A Family Affair, Dirty Mary and Crazy Larry, Little House on the Prairie, Deep Space Nine, and 220 more. Oh, a quick digression. Is that John Agar? You know, Mr. Shirley Temple as he was known at the time. It kind of looks like him. Anyway, let's get back to Jack and Marty. Jack had been working on a show about a lonely private investigator he called Joe Friday, Room 5. Webb thought he could make Joe Friday a policeman and use actual cases from the LAPD files to create a realistic show. He had a good template to work from. He Walked by Night. But let's be honest here. Jack's was not an original idea. It wasn't even an original idea as a radio show or the first show to be based on actual LAPD files. In 1933, CBS aired a program titled Calling All Cars. The show's gimmick was to capitalize on the deployment of radio receiver-equipped police cars that began in 1929, and it featured then Los Angeles Police Chief James Davis to introduce most of the episodes. Calling All Cars was less documentary and more dramatic in style than Dragnet, but the basic premise was there. Now, over the years, I have seen several articles that say Dragnet was inspired by He Walked by Night. That's not really true. He Walked by Night is Dragnet. It has all of the elements. The film opens with a statement that the story is true and only the names have been changed to protect the innocent. It then dissolves into scenes from Los Angeles with appropriate narration. There's the eccentric witness that our hero encounters, the montage of the detectives talking to potential witnesses to track down the suspect, and a narrator telling us the story. Jack first took his idea to CBS. They didn't think much of it. They had a good lineup in place and had no need for another police show. He next tried NBC, and that was a good move for Jack because NBC had a problem. They had recently lost their three biggest shows, Bing Crosby, Jack Benny, and Amos and Andy, to CBS, so they were willing to give Jack's idea a chance. There was just one condition. Jack had to guarantee access to the LAPD case files. Detective Wynn took Jack Webb to his captain, who was intrigued by the idea, and passed them up the chain all the way to Assistant Chief Joe Reed, who read the pilot script and pronounced it good and accurate. The final hurdle was Deputy Chief Clarence Harrall, who declared the script reflected the day-to-day drudgery of police work. Not exactly an ideal formula for a compelling police show, but Jack had what he needed most: access to the crime files. The first episode of Dragnet, titled Robbery, George Slocum, Thief, aired on NBC at 10 p.m. on Friday, June 3, 1949. Unfortunately, that episode seems to have been lost, but most of the other episodes are still with us and available online. The delivery of the dialogue is a little strange to the modern listener, and the announcer's choice of emphasis for the series title in the intro is definitely not the vibe Jack was going for.
Ladies and gentlemen, the story you are about to hear is true. Only the names have been changed to protect the innocent.
Dragnet.
But all of the basics of the later Dragnet series are there. It took a while for Jack and his company to get in the groove, but over time they found their way, and by episode 3, they had Walter Schumann's familiar theme music, and Jack had gotten the announcer to tone down the intro delivery. Also, it was not long before Jack assembled many of the players who became staples of the franchise. The radio program ran in first-run episodes until September 20th, 1955, and thanks to Jack Webb's love of the radio play, continued in reruns until February of 1957. It was one of the last regularly broadcast radio plays. Dragnet was very successful on the radio and was a natural to move to television. Initially, Jack was reluctant to play Joe Friday on TV. His choice for the role was Lloyd Nolan, a well-established stage and screen actor. Who knows how Joe Friday would have turned out with Nolan in the role? We never did find out because the network felt that Webb was so associated with the character from the radio that a change would hurt ratings. For Chief Parker and the LAPD, Dragnet could not have arrived on television at a more opportune time. Like nearly all big city police departments, the LAPD has long dealt with issues of brutality, corruption, and racism, which, although somewhat mitigated through the decades, still exist. Just prior to Dragnet coming to television in 1951, they had gone through what came to be known as the Bloody Christmas Scandal, in which 5 young Mexican Americans and 2 white youths were brutally beaten by a group of LAPD officers, leaving them hospitalized with broken bones and ruptured internal organs. Heavy and sensational reporting in the local newspapers forced an investigation that resulted in 8 police officers being indicted, 54 being transferred from their duties, and 39 being given suspensions of varying lengths. There were also loud calls for civilian oversight of the LAPD, which no one in the department wanted. Dragnet premiered on NBC television in December of 1951, 18 months after William Parker became chief of police. Bent on reforming the department and improving its reputation, Parker recognized that Dragnet could be a valuable tool to that end. Cooperation between the police and Webb's production company, already tight during the radio show's run, became closer still. The show came to TV with Jack as Joe Friday and Barton Yarborough as his partner, Sergeant Ben Romero. Yarborough only appeared in 2 episodes before passing away from a heart attack and was initially replaced by Barney Phillips as Sergeant Ed Jacobs before Ben Alexander came on to play Officer Frank Smith for the remainder of the show's run. Alexander played Frank Smith as the quirky sidekick and provided a contrast to Joe Friday's stoicism. That dynamic played a big part in the TV version of Dragnet's success. Jack Webb also brought his troupe of players from radio to television, which included Peggy Weber, Virginia Gregg, Martin Milner, Stacey Harris, and Vic Perrin. Notable guest appearances were made by Raymond Burr, Lee Marvin, Carolyn Jones, Francis Bavier, and Leonard Nimoy. In 1954, after 3 successful seasons, Jack got the go-ahead for a feature film. He gathered his cast from the TV show and also got some minor star power, with Richard Boone and Dennis Weaver playing small parts. In a film dominated by men, he also added Anne Robinson of War of the Worlds fame as policewoman Grace Downey. Although accurate numbers are hard to come by, it appears Dragnet was successful at the box office, grossing just over $2.9 million against a budget of $800,000. The first TV version of Dragnet wrapped in 1959, and Jack took a hiatus, developing new projects and serving as executive in charge of Warner Brothers Television. In 1965, Universal Studios approached Jack to produce a Dragnet TV movie. He brought the usual suspects together, as it were, and titled the movie Dragnet 1966. Stepping back to the show's He Walked by Night roots, Jack used a relatively recent case for his storyline, that of serial killer Harvey Glattman. I'll save his story for another time. NBC liked the result, and rather than air the one-time TV movie, they thought it would do better as a regular series. Jack was initially reluctant, but later agreed, and Dragnet returned to NBC. Dragnet 1966 did not air until 1969, which is when I first saw it. Jack wanted Ben Alexander to return as Frank Smith, but he was already committed to a show called Felony Squad and was unavailable, so Harry Morgan was brought in as Officer Bill Gannon. The new version of Dragnet was less documentary in style and a little lighter in tone, but it still followed the same format as the original. The first episode, titled The LSD Story, was ranked by TV Guide as number 85 on its 2009 list of the 100 greatest TV episodes of all time. The first 2 seasons focused on basic crime stories. Season 3 took a different approach and included several public relations themes, such as an internal affairs episode and one showing the difficulties that a female police officer in training could encounter. The LAPD reviewed and approved all of the scripts, and in some cases scripts were rejected because they had too negative a tone or portrayed the LAPD in a way they disagreed with. Jack shelved those scripts without a complaint. During its second run, Dragnet's ratings were reasonably consistent. It was not a huge hit, but generally a top 20 show, dropping off slightly in its last year. It moved almost immediately into syndication and continued on TV well into the 1970s. The last episode, titled The Victims, was darker than we had become used to. It begins with Friday and Gannon logging in weapons used in a robbery murder. They get called away to a homicide in a hotel. They have a discussion with a reporter who tells them that murder is so common that the victim's case won't get a mention in the papers, and there was a homeless man who was robbed of 76 cents he made by collecting and returning soda bottles. Joe and Bill head out on patrol and work a purse snatching where the perps assaulted the elderly victim. Along the way, Joe lectures a cocky rookie officer about empathy and learning from his partner. Joe got a little preachy towards the end of the series. Finally, Joe and Bill are called to a robbery at a small grocery store where the owner and a customer have been shot. The owner is rushed to the hospital where he passes away, and a priest arrives to perform last rites. The suspect is caught and brought to the same hospital for treatment of a facial cut he received during the robbery. As Bill finishes reading the suspect his Miranda rights, the store owner's remains are taken down the same hallway to the morgue, passing Joe and the now patched-up wounded customer. The last line in the series is spoken by actor Howard Culver as the customer, Tim Walker. "Sure is a great world, isn't it, Sergeant? That 2-bit thief gets his rights, and Julio gets his last ones." So ended Dragnet's second life. During the run of this second iteration of the series, some people, especially members of Los Angeles' minority communities, found the show to be nothing more than a propaganda tool for the LAPD. Their concerns were genuine and valid. The LAPD continued to review and approve scripts for the show, and Jack never put up much of a fight for those that were rejected. Jack went on to produce a new LAPD-themed police procedural, Adam 12, starring Martin Milner and Kent McCord. Milner was one of Jack's players from the original version of Dragnet. McCord had several roles in the second Dragnet series and a small part in the Dragnet 1966 movie. In 1972, Jack Webb premiered a new TV series, Emergency, focusing on paramedics in the Los Angeles area. This series featured Jack's ex-wife, Julie London, and her new husband, Bobby Troop. I'm sure that made the dynamics on set interesting. At the time the series premiered, there were only 2 paramedic programs in Los Angeles and only 12 in the entire country. Before that, ambulances were not much more than a scoop and run service. Emergency was credited with raising awareness of the benefits of medically trained crews as first responders in the U.S., and the result is the modern EMTs that serve us all today. In 1982, Jack had been approached to do another revival of Dragnet and was working on the details, but his deteriorating health slowed the work. Jack was an asthmatic child and as an adult took up smoking. That's not surprising, as everybody smoked in those days. The original radio show and the first TV version were both sponsored by Liggett & Myers, a tobacco company that made L&M, Chesterfield, and Fatima cigarettes. These were touted as mild, low-nicotine cigarettes, and Jack was loyal to his sponsors, so he smoked them. But he smoked 2 to 3 packs a day. At about 3 a.m. on December 23, 1982, Jack awoke complaining of abdominal pain. He went to the kitchen to get some milk, where he collapsed. His wife called paramedics who attempted to revive him to no avail, and he was pronounced dead at 3:23 a.m. due to a myocardial infarction. He had a heart attack. The official cause was occlusive coronary artery disease. Basically, his coronary arteries were clogged. Jack Webb was buried at Forest Lawn Cemetery with full honors rendered by the Los Angeles Police Department. Chief Darrell Gates ordered badge number 714 retired, and the badge used in the show was put on display in the LAPD Museum, but a replica was placed in Jack Webb's casket and buried with him. The first revival of Dragnet following Jack's passing came in 1987 as a movie starring Dan Aykroyd and Tom Hanks. Aykroyd plays Joe Friday's nephew, conveniently named Joe Friday. He's a caricature of Jack Webb's Joe Friday, pathologically straight-laced and monotone. Tom Hanks, in his early slapstick comedic days, plays Pep Strebeck, the polar opposite of Friday. I won't go too deep into the plot, but it involves a cult, goats, and goat fur chaps. The film did well at the box office, and it's a good watch, but if you are looking for a continuation of the series, this is not it. After Jack's death, there were 2 more attempts to revive the television series. The first, in 1989, was titled The New Dragnet. With new characters in place of Joe and his partners, it bore no resemblance to the original concept and lasted 2 seasons in syndication. The second try, titled L.A. Dragnet, starred Ed O'Neill as Joe Friday and Ethan Embry as Frank Smith. The show was produced by Dick Wolf of Law & Order fame and followed the standard Dragnet format for its first season. O'Neill was still trying to escape Al Bundy of Married with Children, and while he is a great actor, his presence may be why the show just couldn't capture an audience. It was a drama, after all. For its second season, the producers promoted Friday to lieutenant and reduced his screen time while converting the show into a typical police drama. That didn't work, and it was canceled halfway through its second season. And thus ends our story. So we'll finish with some commentary. Erwin Walker's case was the classic example of mid-century police work, much of which is still valid today. Marty Wynn hit the streets, talked to people, and got a tip that led to the perpetrator. Modern police work adds a lot of science to the job. They would have collected trace evidence, DNA, and other things, but even today, it is rare for any of that to lead to a suspect. Forensic evidence can incriminate or exonerate a suspect, but only in the rarest of cases does it lead to one. In the end, police work is all about making contacts, finding people who know something about the crime, and getting answers. Forensic science helps get convictions, but it's old-fashioned footwork that leads to arrests. That's what Dragnet showed the public. the long haul, sometimes laborious, often painstaking drudgery of detective work. What Dragnet didn't show us is what often happened later. Had Walker's crimes been covered on Dragnet, we would have seen a picture of him at the end of the show telling us that he was awaiting the gas chamber at San Quentin, and that would have been it. What really happened is he was only at San Quentin for just under a year and a half before he was moved to a mental health facility. Eventually, he not only avoided the gas chamber, but also found himself a free man. Dragnet, even though it was a mid-rated show, became iconic. The show was formulaic, the acting often fluctuated between wooden and over the top, and its attempts at social commentary were usually heavy-handed and a little tone-deaf. Dear God, those Joe Friday monologues. But I'm positive that a whole lot of people learned their Miranda rights from Joe Friday and Bill Gannon. Joe never said, "just the facts, man," but enough people think he said it that the phrase entered the popular lexicon. In the end, it was an influential show. Erwin Walker's case demonstrated how the justice system worked even back in the 1940s. Today, many people like to think that justice was always swift and sure in those days. Things did move somewhat quicker, but more often did not. The famous case of Carol Chessman, the red light killer, was one that dragged on for years, and Erwin Walker was another. Chessman's crime spree followed just a year after Walker's. Walker was convicted and sentenced, but the sentence was not carried out, and he was eventually paroled. Chessman wasn't so lucky, and his sentence was carried out in 1960. History doesn't record how Walker's victims felt about his ultimate release from prison. He disappeared into obscurity and committed no further crimes, so I guess, despite his sentence not being carried out, society was ultimately protected in his case. So we come to the end. This has been Crime Noir, Episode 4, He Walked by Night, the Hollywood crime spree that spawned a TV franchise. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and let me know your thoughts in the comments. Join us next time as we visit a fondness for animals gone out of control. Our next episode, The Great Zanesville Massacre.